Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I want to show you a couple of, for lack of a better term, drum mixing tips. I've been experimenting with some different techniques and some different things on a rock drum track to get these acoustic drums to just be big, bold, and full. And I've been doing some of this stuff for a long time, and I thought maybe I'd share it with you, and maybe you guys can leave some comments below and share some of your tips on how you get big, fat, rock and roll drums. Now you can do this either on a console with hardware like we're going to do here, or you can do all of this stuff in the box too with plugins. It's kind of the same techniques. But before we get started, you like what you see in the video, please consider subscribing. Also hit the notification bell. Also, if this channel helps you in any way and you enjoy these videos, consider supporting the channel by hitting the thanks button, and also go out to mixingmusicanalog.com if you want to learn more about what I do with mixing and mastering services. So here we are on the SSL. So over here in Studio One, we have just an acoustic drum kit here, and I have some bass and some guitars that we'll bring in for context in a little bit. So let me first play back for you kind of the beginning sound of these drums. So let's just take a look at what we have here in our session here in Studio One. So if you take a look up here, we have over here in brown, we have a kick, our kick, an acoustic kick, and then we have an acoustic sample track, which I'm gonna mute for now to give you kind of the starting point. Then we have a snare top, a snare sample, which I mute, a snare bottom, hi-hats, one rack tom, one floor tom, and a set of overheads. Then we also have some parallel tracks, which I'll talk about in a minute for kick and snare. We're gonna shut those off for now. I already muted these on the console. So here is kind of the starting point with just the drum sounds. And then I'll bring in the bass and the two guitars so you can kind of hear it in context. So here's what we're kind of starting with. Raw drums, kind of, mixed, balanced, panned, EQ on the console, but no extra flavor. This is just the starting point. So here we go. Let's bring this back here so you can hear what we're doing here. Here we go. So that's kind of the starting point. So drums sound pretty good, not bad. They certainly don't sound bad. They're EQ'd, they're balanced, they sound pretty good. They fit with the bass and the guitars without too much problem. It sounds good, but I wanted these drums to kind of be bigger. So how do we get these drums big and full and just more rock and more in your face so it kind of keeps up with the bass and the guitars, these heavy guitars especially? So there's a few things that I do to achieve this. There's really 5 things that I do to achieve this. So let's talk about what we're going to do here. So let's go back in here into Studio One. So as I said, the very first thing I do when we have kick and snare, I always will add a kick sample and a snare sample, or on our snare top and a kick sample, and I'll route those out to the console. So I have my first original kick drum coming to channel 1 here on the console, and then I just duplicate the track and put that on another track, route that out to the second channel on the console. On that, I'm just using Trigger 2 by Slate, pretty industry standard, and I'm using a DW kick drum, which sounds like this. Pretty standard stuff. And then from there, I have our snare top, our regular acoustic snare top, and then I add a snare sample. And on that snare sample, again, I'm using Trigger 2, and I think I'm using, what am I using here? I think I'm just using a Ludwig Black Beauty direct mic. Again, pretty standard. Okay, now one of the things that I do here on this, let me just unmute the kick here. So on the snare, one of the things I do other than just adding a sample is on this snare sample, I'm also detuning this about 3 cents down. I'm pitching it down a little bit to give it a little bit of a fatter sound. So if I give you just the snare drums, just the two snare drums by themselves, the snare top and the snare sample, here's what that sounds like. So now if I take away the sample, here's just the original snare. Okay, so that's what the snare sample's adding. Now if I take this back to 0, I'll just put this at regular tuning. Here's that snare, top regular snare, and the sample without the detune of the sample. So you can hear as I hit -3 on that sample and detune that sample a little bit, that snare, it just adds a little bit of thickness to the overall snare sound. It gives it a little bit more body and a little bit more thickness. Usually -3 is usually what I do. -6 is a little too low. If I detune this down to -6. I mean, -6 can work, but in this particular track, I kind of like -3, and then I blend the two together. So that's the first thing I do. And then I add that kick sample, and the kick sample's not detuned in any way, just a regular old sample. So then I blend them together and EQ them. So here's the kick snare combination. Now if I bring in the rest of the drum kit here with those two samples. Okay, now without those two samples, I'll take them out and I'll bring them in halfway through. So that's the first thing I do. So the first thing I do is get kick sample, snare sample, detune the snare sample, -3, and that usually seems to work, gives a little bit of fatness. Now the rest of the drum kit, we just have snare bottom, hi-hats, a couple of toms and overheads. It's all we have here. The second thing I do after that is I'm going to add a parallel compression track for both the kick and the snare only. So you'll see here in Studio One, what I did down here in purple is, again, I just duplicate the kick and the snare, and I bring it over here towards the end. I made them in purple so you can see them. One's called parallel kick, one's called parallel snare, and then I route those out to two separate faders here on the console. So the original kick and snare and the sample kick and snare are all on separate faders, as well as the parallel kick and the parallel snare. And on those are then being routed out to a couple of compressors, and you'll see in the rack in a second or so. I'm routing these out in this example to a pair of DBX 160As, and I have those over there, and I have those coming, one on the kick, one on the snare, and I'm compressing about 6-8 dB on these. I'm compressing them pretty hard, and then I'm just blending them in. So if I were to now play this thing back and then just add the kick and the snare parallel, here's what it kind of does, and I'll exaggerate it so you can really hear it, and then I'll tuck it in. So let me come back here to the beginning. So you can really hear the difference there. It really makes a big difference, that kick and snare. And again, I'll bring this all in context with the bass and the guitars in a second. So that after I do the parallel kick and snare, the next thing I do is I route it all these direct mics except for the kick and snare down to a drum bus. And on that drum bus, I'm using a compressor. I'm not doing any compression on the individual drum tracks at all, only on the parallels at this point. But now I'm adding a compressor to that bus as well. And on that drum bus, I'm using the Wes Audio NG bus compressor. You can see it here on the screen. It's a digital controlled hardware unit. So what I'll do is I'll just play this back. It's in bypass and I'll bring it in so you can kind of hear what that does. So again, it tightens up the kick a little bit. It gives a little bit more sustain to the snare, and it kind of tightens up the entire kit. It's the only compression that I'm using on the drum kit except for the parallel tracks. On the NG bus compressor, I'm also using the transformer iron circuit as well as the total harmonic distortion circuit, just in a small dose, just to kind of give it a little bit more flavor. And then from there, after that, I'm also then patching in, after the compressor, the API 5500 EQ, and there'll probably be an image that'll come up on the screen in a second. It'll show you the settings that I have for that. I'm really just boosting around 460B at 50 Hertz, a little bit at 5K, and then a little bit, I believe, at 10K, just to give a little bit of top, a little bit of bottom. And let me I'll play that back. I'll unbypass the EQ because it's in bypass mode right now, and you'll hear what that does as well. Here we go. Right? So that, again, brings in a little low end, a little bit of top end. So now let me bring back the bass and the guitars here, and let me balance them a little bit. And then what I'll do is I'll let it play with everything in the circuit. And then what I'll do is I'll go bypass the EQ, I'll bypass the bus compressor, I'll take out the parallel tracks, I'll mute the sample tracks, and then I'll bring them all back in stages so you can hear all 4 or 5 stages of what all this stuff does as an accumulative effect. Here we go. So that's kind of where we started. That's with none of the processing in. That's without the samples, without the parallel, without the compressor, without the EQ. Now let me bring it all back in stages. You'll see over the top here, you'll see that the tracks that are muted here are in red. So when they're red, that means they're muted. So I'll unmute the samples, I'll unmute the parallel tracks, then I'll unbypass the compressor, I'll unbypass the EQ, and you'll hear how this whole drum kit kind of comes alive. Here we go. I'll start at the beginning again. So it makes a big difference. So just by doing those 4 things, it makes the drum kit just be bigger and bolder. It keeps up with the guitars a lot more, and a big heavy rock track like this. And there's more instruments in this that I didn't bring in. It really helps those drums cut through the mix and really stay up front. Now the last thing I'll do, which I don't have on right now, is I'll put a little reverb on this. I'm using the Neve AMS 500 series reverb, digital reverb, and I really just have it mostly on the overheads and the snare. I just use a little bit of reverb. I typically don't use reverb on drums on the direct mics. I normally don't ever put it on kicks, toms, and snare is about maybe 50-50. It really depends on the track. If I have overheads and rooms that are recorded well, I'll typically put just the reverb on the overheads and or the rooms to extend the sound of the room that's already there, as opposed to putting something artificial on the direct mics. I want the direct mics to be upfront and as punchy as possible in a rock track like this, especially when you're competing with big heavy guitars. But in this particular case, we only have a pair of overheads and they're kind of wimpy. So I did add a little bit of reverb to the snare as well. Not a lot though. If you want to hear the reverb here, I'll get rid of the bass and the guitar. Like a drum room. That's the reverb. So over the top camera, when the red light is on, it means it's bypassed. When it's not on, it means it's in the circuit. I'll start with it off. I'll bring in the bass and the guitars again, and then I'll bring the reverb, drum reverb in so you can kind of hear what it does. And there we go. So those are 4 things, or actually 5 things if you count the reverb, that you can do to just get the drums bigger and bolder and more in your face by using samples, detuning a sample, using parallel on kick and snare, and then going ahead and adding some drum bus EQ. And again, we're not doing a lot of drum bus compression, I should say. Not a lot of drum bus compression, less than 4 dB. We're not compressing on any of the individual tracks, and then we're adding a little bit of drum bus EQ and then a little bit of reverb, and that just gets the drums big, fat, and bold. So that's what we're gonna finish up with in this video. Let me know in the comments below what other little production and mixing tips that you have to get those big fat drum sounds and big rock drums. I'd be interested to know what you guys think below. And then in a future video, I'm gonna show you also how I mix with guitar pedals, maybe adding some distortion and stuff like that. We'll do a separate video on that. So once again, please like, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell, hit the thanks button if you wanna support the channel. And don't forget to go out to mixingmusicanalog.com if you wanna learn more about what I do here and my mixing and mastering services. And soon to come, in the beginning of 2023, we're going to have some hybrid mixing training courses available for you. So stay tuned for that. So until the next video, I've been Dave with Mixing Music Analog and mixingmusicanalog.com. Thank you so very much for watching me today. I hope you had fun, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care, everybody.